Well, you mentioned drones. I think let's use this opportunity now to move to the case of Daniel Hale. I think just as revealing of the menacing of whistleblowers and assault on civil liberties. So you had a piece. Daniel Hale went to prison for telling the truth about U.S. drone war. Tell us who Daniel Hale was and his significance to our understanding of the world today, and also the way his punishment is sort of for his righteousness in a way.
Yeah, I wrote two pieces for Jacobin about Daniel Hale, one after he pled guilty and one after having attended the sentencing hearing, which was very depressing. Daniel Hale was a veteran of the U.S. Air Force. He was assigned to the NSA and thus stationed at Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan. Bagram is where they do the drone strikes. He was part of the kill chain where they sort of would use people's cell phones to track them. They could then have drones follow them around to spy on them, but also assassinate them, right? This is both a surveillance and a global assassination program. And while he was sitting in Bagram, he wrote a very moving letter. He also gave a very moving speech in the court. The transcript isn't from yet. I mean, he describes the first time he witnesses a drone strike. He said, he's talking about there's this sort of wanted Taliban individual. He gathers in the early morning with other men who are armed, although as Hale notes, where he's from in Virginia, carrying arms was not outside the norm, nor is it in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And they were drinking tea. And because these men were military age, they had arms, and they were in, the vicinity of an enemy combatant, it was okay to kill them too. And he just sort of describes this in his letter. Despite having peacefully assembled, posing no threat, the fate of the now tea-drinking men had all but been fulfilled. I could only look on as I sat by and watched through a computer monitor when a sudden, terrifying flurry of hellfire missiles came crashing down, splattering purple-colored crystal guts on the side of the Morningside Mountain. By the rules of engagement, it may have been permissible for me to have helped kill those men whose language I did not speak, whose customs I did not understand, and crimes I could not identify in the gruesome manner that I did. Watch them die. But how could it be considered honorable of me to continuously have laid in wait for the next opportunity to kill unsuspecting persons who more often than not in no danger to any other person at that time? And he describes similar things in this letter. And then when he returns stateside, he goes to a book event of journalist Jeremy Scahill. He later appears on stage with Scahill. He attends a Code Pink anti-drone summit where someone who is a victim of the drone strike whose family is a victim of a drone strike, describes it. Hale, sitting in the audience, having watched it take place on this computer screen. He then gets a job as a defense contractor with Leidos, as I believe the name of it, at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency to sort of work on geo-mapping of China. And while he's there one day, his coworkers decide as entertainment, let's watch videos of drone strikes, at which point he decides that he has to end this cycle of violence by sort of putting his own freedom in jeopardy. And he goes and gives this information to Jeremy Scahill. And, one of the things these documents show is that during one 5-month period in Afghanistan, 90% of those killed by U.S. drone strikes, or not U.S. airstrikes, were not the intended target, 90%. And The Intercept publishes information first about the no-fly list, which is used by Muslim American civil rights groups successfully to challenge people's wrongful placement on it. And then they publish the drone papers, which is this groundbreaking look at sort of this human cost of the drone program based on these documents. In 2014, his home is raided by the FBI in connection with a Espionage Act investigation. In 2015, a year later, The Intercept publishes the drone papers. In 2019, we're now 5 years later, another presidential administration, he's indicted for under 5 counts, multiple counts on the Espionage Act. And then in 2021, he pleads guilty to violating one of the counts of the Espionage Act. And then he is sentenced to 45 months in prison for this.
Yeah, and you mentioned in your piece the way the judge sort of I don't know, did you say sympathized with or also wanted to send a message about like don't be too righteous in the wrong way.
Yeah, it was very interesting to watch because the government has a playbook with these Espionage Act prosecutions. It's remarkable. Um, it's so similar on case by case. They always say the person was a narcissist, they were a malcontent, they had no good motives, and in this case, the prosecution tried to argue that Hale was motivated by vanity and wanting to advance his non-existent career as a journalist. Hale was very reluctant to mount any kind of public campaign for himself as he was being railroaded by the government because he wanted the focus to be on the victims of drone strikes, not on him. When he was arrested, he was working as a dishwasher, right? The idea that he is a vain guy who wants to be a rock star journalist, as the prosecutor asserted, is just like pathetically, right, like divorced from reality. And the judge did acknowledge, and this usually does not happen. Usually the judge buys into the prosecution's demonization campaign, that a number of people had written letters to him. I sent a letter requested by the defense to the judge. Lots of people did as well. And that they thought he was courageous and conscientious and a whistleblower. And the judge agreed with their assessment, but that he could have been a whistleblower without giving these documents to Jeremy Scahill of The Intercept, and that many Americans would have applauded him for alerting them to the civilian casualties of the drone program. It's really weird to watch because the judge was, acknowledging Daniel Hale was courageous, acknowledging Daniel Hale was conscientious, and acknowledging that the U.S. drone program kills a lot of civilians. And the American people, if they knew this, would be outraged by it, which is not the way things normally go. And it's worth pointing out the government wanted like a baseline of 9 years. So they got like a third of the sentence they wanted. And Hale's sentence is actually shorter than some other recent Espionage Act prosecutions for similar people. Had the prosecution got the sentence they wanted, it would have been the longest sentence ever given in a civilian court by a long shot, and it would have been the longest sentence ever served by anyone. Chelsea Manning got 35 years in a military court, but Obama, I believe, commuted her sentence after like 7 years. I think that's what he commuted it to. He didn't pardon her. He didn't free her immediately. He just commuted her sentence to a lesser sentence. So she was actually still in jail for months and months after the commutation. I don't think people realized that. He just sort of reduced the sentence, didn't immediately free her as he should have done. And so it's a real sort of mixed bag of emotions because 45 months, Daniel Hale should not be in jail a day. And 45 months is still an outrageously long sentence when you look at the broad trajectory of whistleblower prosecutions, but it is not what the prosecution wanted, and it is not in line with this recent sort of escalation of things, right? The prosecution wanted to take Reality Winner's 5-year sentence and argue that's the baseline sentence, everything else should be longer, and the judge didn't go along with that, to his credit.
It just seems so bizarre that sort of psychoanalysis would be relevant in a courtroom. Like he wants to start a journalism career.
Yeah, I mean, who cares?
Yeah, I mean that's.
I mean, a lot of people are motivated by personal vanity to do good things, right?
Yeah, and I think another thing that's really worth mentioning is why Daniel Hale probably pled is just that he had no meaningful chance of a defense. The Espionage Act language is written something like intent to or reason to believe could harm U.S. national security. The way that judges have interpreted this is that if you get this notice that classified information can harm the U.S. when it's released, and government says it's classified and you release it, you have reason to believe it will harm national defense, no questions asked, so you're guilty. So in most of these cases, literally all you have to prove was, did you give it to a journalist? And that's usually known. And the prosecution will ask the judge And in Hale's case, like in every other case, the judge agreed to bar Hale from mentioning his good motives. Hale was also not allowed to challenge the classification of the documents, both because classification is the sole domain of the executive branch. A judge can't rule a document is wrongfully classified. And even if he could, and even if a document was wrongfully classified, being properly classified is not an element of the Espionage Act offense. Hale was also not allowed to bring up the fact that it was selective prosecution, that many people leak information. They're not prosecuted. You're only prosecuted if you leak information the government doesn't, that embarrasses the government. So this is a political prosecution, like all Espionage Act prosecutions of whistleblowers. And he wasn't even allowed to assert that someone else could have given the documents to Scahill unless he could name a specific individual and explain how he did it. So zero chance of a defense. In sentencing, Hale's lawyers asked the judge to compel the prosecution to disclose any evidence of harm. The prosecution fought that, saying the Espionage Act doesn't require harm. They're not going to argue harm to the U.S. national defense at sentencing, and the judge rules in their favor. And then they turn around and say, because Hale isn't acknowledging the grave harm he's doing, he's not truly sorry. He's like a heroin dealer who says, dealing heroin is good for the community. That's the actual analogy they used. Jeez. And they even flat out assert he aided ISIS, which, okay, show us the harm assessment then. So they fought to not disclose evidence of harm because they didn't have it, and then said, you're not admitting you did harm, even though you wanted this evidence of harm. You're not significantly remorseful. Throw the book at him.